The sea air of Charleston always carried whispers, but in the sweltering heat of late summer, they felt heavier, like the city itself was trying to warn anyone who wandered too deep into its past. The old streets, polished by centuries of footsteps, seemed to pull visitors toward places no map dared to detail. And somewhere beyond the manicured charm and pastel facades lay a corner of history that even lifelong residents refused to speak about. It began with the discovery of a single entry in a plantation ledger, its ink faded yet unsettlingly precise, the brief record of a pregnant enslaved woman whose name appeared nowhere else in the historical archives, as though someone had tried to erase her from every surviving memory. Her disappearance had been labeled inexplicable, a word scribbled in hurried strokes, as if the writer feared the truth pressing against the edges of his own handwriting. The historian who found the ledger described an immediate, unshakable sensation, the feeling of being watched from behind, though the room was empty. That same night, a strange lullaby drifted through the cracks of an old windowpane, a tune so old it didn't appear in any collection of Carolina folk music. From that moment onward, the past refused to remain buried. Local accounts regarding the woman were scattered, contradictory, and tinged with fear, each version more disjointed than the last. Some residents remembered a young woman with quiet eyes, others insisted she never existed at all. And yet, every witness carried the same unease, as if recalling her meant brushing against something they were not supposed to feel. The historian's search led through dust-coated archives, decaying rooms, and stories whispered behind closed doors. Every new discovery hinted that the woman's pregnancy was not merely a tragic footnote of slavery, but a secret the city had tried fiercely to bury. Strange sketches hidden in attic rafters, journals sealed for generations, and testimonies recorded in trembling voices all pointed toward the same chilling conclusion: whatever happened in Charleston in 1834 had left a mark that time could not erase. And as the historian dug deeper, the air around him began to shift, turning colder in spaces that should have been warm, as though someone was returning to watch him retrace the path she once walked, a path that ended in silence no one had ever been able to explain. The discovery of the unearthed ledger began on an ordinary afternoon, the kind where the dust in the Charleston archives hung perfectly still, suspended like tiny ghosts in a beam of light. The historian wasn't searching for anything unusual that day, he was cataloguing plantation records from the early 1800s, routine work that rarely offered surprises. Most ledgers followed the same cold pattern: lists of names, ages, labor assignments, births, deaths. But this particular book felt different from the moment he touched it. Its leather binding was softer, as if handled too often, and the ink on the spine appeared deliberately rubbed away. When he opened it, the pages crackled softly, fragile, brittle from humidity, carrying the faint smell of smoke even though they showed no signs of burning. The entries were typical at first, just columns and numbers, but midway through the book, a name appeared that sent a shiver through him. A woman identified only as Mara, marked as pregnant, with no age, no origin, no notes about her duties. Every enslaved person recorded in that era had information carefully logged. These records determined labor, ownership, value. But Mara's entry stood alone in its vagueness, as if someone had included her reluctantly or under pressure. He leaned closer, tracing the neat handwriting that suddenly grew unsteady only in her section. Next to her name was a brief comment, a single line that looked scratched rather than written: removed, cause unknown. The words didn't fit the tone of the ledger. They didn't match the meticulous style used throughout the book. It felt like a message forced into the margins by a trembling hand, as though the writer wanted the record to exist but feared what acknowledging it might bring. There was no follow-up entry, no indication of where she was taken, no death report, no sale documentation, nothing. It was as though Mara appeared and vanished within the same breath, left behind only by an archivist too afraid to erase her completely. The historian flipped ahead, searching for more clues, but the next several pages had faint impressions as if someone had pressed a heavy object onto them years ago. No ink remained, only the ghost of writing that refused to reveal itself under any angle of light. He felt an unsettling sensation rise in his chest, the instinctive awareness that he had stumbled onto something not meant to be found. The temperature seemed to shift in the room, and for a brief moment, he had the uncanny sense that someone stood behind him. When he turned, the room was empty, but the silence felt different, charged, watchful. That ledger had held thousands of names across decades, Yet it was Mara's fleeting trace, her brief presence between two yellowed pages, that seemed to breathe, demanding attention after nearly 2 centuries of enforced silence. When the historian began searching for traces of Mara beyond the ledger, he expected the usual challenges of aging documents and fading ink, but he did not expect the unsettling haze that surrounded every mention of her within Charleston's oral history. The first person he interviewed was an elderly man who had lived his entire life near the old plantation district. His memory was sharp, yet when the historian mentioned the name Mara, the man paused, blinked several times, and then claimed he had never heard of such a person. But as the historian prepared to leave, the man called him back, voice lowered, eyes drifting toward the floorboards, and said he recalled a story about a pregnant enslaved woman who didn't belong to any of the records, though he insisted her name was different. When pressed, he grew visibly tense, as if remembering too much would invite something unwelcome into the room. The historian spoke to others, descendants of enslaved families, longtime residents, amateur historians. Each claimed to know a version of the story, yet every version contradicted the last. Some described a young woman with a quiet presence, someone who kept to herself and was rarely seen outside the quarters. Others swore she was outspoken, fearless, and often punished for defiance. One person said she disappeared in the middle of a stormy night, another insisted she vanished during harvest season, under a clear sky. There were even stories that she wasn't a real woman at all but an omen, a sign of misfortune the plantation owners feared. Nearly every witness delivered their story with a tremor in their voice, as though the memory itself carried weight. The contradictions weren't natural inconsistencies from old tales, they felt deliberate, as if every storyteller had been gently pushed away from the truth generations ago. The historian noticed something even stranger. Whenever he mentioned Mara's pregnancy, people reacted as though he had stepped over a boundary. Some tightened their lips and refused to continue. Others whispered that there were things best left unspoken, especially when tied to that particular stretch of land. A few simply walked away without explanation. It was as though the very idea of her pregnant, missing, forgotten, triggered a quiet alarm in the minds of those who knew the stories but had spent their lives being told not to repeat them. The deeper the historian dug, the more tangled the web became. Conversations ended abruptly. Doors that seemed open at first quickly closed. The contradictions didn't weaken the mystery, they strengthened it, forming a pattern of avoidance that suggested collective fear rather than simple confusion. Everyone seemed to remember something, but no two memories aligned, and it soon became clear that the truth about Mara had been buried not by accident, but by generations of people who believed speaking her story aloud invited consequences they were unwilling to face. When the historian finally gained permission to inspect the preserved slave quarters on the old Charleston property, he expected the same worn-out structures he had visited countless times in his research: cramped wooden rooms, low ceilings, brick fireplaces stained with soot, the quiet stiffness of a place built from suffering. But something about this particular set of quarters felt different the moment he stepped inside. The air was colder than the muggy afternoon outside, sharp enough to raise goosebumps on his arms. The boards creaked beneath his feet in a way that felt almost responsive, as though the building itself acknowledged his presence. As he walked down the narrow corridor connecting the small rooms, he noticed that the final door on the left was not listed in the property's architectural blueprints. He flipped through the copies he carried, frowning, certain he had missed something. Yet the plans, drawn decades ago by preservation teams, showed a solid wall where he was now staring at a locked wooden door. It was an older door than the others, constructed from heavier wood, its hinges blackened not by rust but by something that looked like soot or ash. The keyhole was unusually small and packed with debris, as if it hadn't been opened in centuries. He pressed his ear against it, expecting silence, but instead he heard something faint, almost like a soft scraping, a sound so slight he wasn't sure if it was real or a trick of his imagination. The historian stepped back, unsettled. No door should exist here, and yet it stood before him, stubbornly, as though anchoring a part of the building the blueprints deliberately chose not to acknowledge. He flagged down the property caretaker, a man who had spent 20 years giving tours and restoring the grounds. When asked about the door, the caretaker's demeanor changed almost instantly. The warmth drained from his face, replaced with a tightness around the eyes. He claimed he had never noticed the door before, even though he walked this hallway daily. The historian didn't believe him, not for a moment, because the caretaker's gaze avoided the door as though looking directly at it triggered a memory he had spent years pushing away. The historian pressed further, but the caretaker's voice grew curt, and he insisted the door must have been part of a storage area or an outdated section sealed long ago. But the historian could see fear plainly in the man's behavior. No one forgets a door, not one like this. The historian took several photographs before leaving, but each time he looked at them later, he felt a growing sense of unease. Something about the measurements was wrong, the angles, the way the shadows fell, the slight distortion around the frame. It was as if the door were not simply abandoned or hidden, but actively resisting being remembered, holding back a truth that had remained sealed inside those walls for nearly 200 years. The reports began quietly, almost dismissively, as if the people experiencing them weren't sure whether to trust their own senses. The historian first heard about the night whispers from a woman who lived in a restored townhouse near the old plantation district. She told him she often woke at exactly 3:07 a.m., the time so precise it felt unnatural, as though something intended for her to notice it. At first, she thought it was just the settling of old wood or the distant churn of the harbor wind, but the sounds grew clearer with each passing night. She described hearing gentle knocks, always 3 of them, spaced evenly apart, followed by a faint humming. The tune was soft and strangely soothing, the kind a mother might hum to a restless child, except it carried an eerie quality, as if it drifted from somewhere too far away to belong to the living. When the historian collected more testimonies, he found the pattern repeated across multiple households. People who had no connection to each other reported the same sound at nearly the same time every night. Some claimed the humming came from under their floorboards, others swore it floated down from their attics, and a few insisted it originated right outside their bedroom doors. One elderly resident said she had heard the lullaby since she was a child, and that her mother had heard it too, warning her never to follow the sound if it seemed to come from outside. She recalled her mother whispering that the song belonged to someone who had once been trapped, someone who still wandered, trying to reach the child she never got to hold. The historian knew lullabies from the 1800s well. He had listened to hundreds for his research. But when residents hummed the tune for him, he couldn't match it to any known Carolina melody. It had the structure of a cradle song but carried a subtle rhythm that felt foreign, almost out of time. What unsettled him most was the emotional pull of the melody. Even in a simple hum, it carried a sadness so profound it felt impossible for anyone hearing it to remain unaffected. Several people admitted the voice sounded too close to be imagined. One man said he felt breath on his cheek as the lullaby drifted past him, yet when he opened his eyes, the room was empty. The historian began spending nights near the district, hoping to hear the mysterious knocks and humming for himself. It didn't take long. On the 3rd night, as he lay awake staring at the cracked ceiling of a rented room, he felt a pressure in the air shift, almost like a drop in temperature without any physical breeze. At exactly 3:07, he heard it, a soft, rhythmic knock, followed by a low, fragile melody threading itself through the darkness, too clear to dismiss as imagination, too sorrowful to belong to anyone still alive. The doctor's journal came to the historian by accident, tucked inside a box of unrelated medical records that had been mislabeled and forgotten in the archive basement for decades. The leather cover was cracked, and several pages were stuck together from humidity, but the handwriting inside was precise and controlled, the script of someone accustomed to observing the world with clinical detachment. At first, the entries were nothing more than routine notes about fevers, injuries, ailments common on large plantations. But halfway through the journal, the historian found an entry dated just days before Mara vanished, and the tone of the writing shifted so dramatically that it felt like stepping into an entirely different world. The doctor described being summoned late at night to examine an enslaved woman whose pregnancy had taken an unexpected turn. He mentioned that the overseer insisted the examination remain private, allowing no witnesses, not even the midwives who usually assisted. The doctor wrote that he expected complications, perhaps malnutrition, infection, or early labor. Instead, he found something that unsettled him deeply, something he struggled to put into words. His normally orderly handwriting wavered, the lines uneven, as though his hand had trembled during the entry. He wrote that the woman's pulse was steady but strangely slow, too slow for someone carrying a child in the late stages of pregnancy. Her skin was cool to the touch, yet she was not feverish. The part that disturbed him most was the movement beneath her ribs. Not the usual shifting of a child, but something sharper, more deliberate, as if whatever was inside her responded not to her body, but to the presence of others in the room. He described placing his hand on her abdomen and feeling a sensation that made him recoil, a sensation he initially believed to be a muscle spasm until it happened again, stronger, more defined, as if something inside had pressed outward with purpose. The doctor tried to remain rational, noting that exhaustion and dim lantern light might have altered his perception. But he admitted that the woman's eyes unsettled him more than the physical anomalies. She watched him with an expression he could only describe as resigned fear, as though she already knew what he would find and understood it better than he did. At one point, she whispered something too faint for him to hear fully, but he thought the word sounded like not mine, or perhaps not human. His final sentence in the entry was written with such pressure it nearly tore the paper: "This pregnancy does not follow the nature of man." The historian reread the passage several times, each repetition tightening the cold knot forming in his stomach. There were no further entries after that night. The journal ended abruptly, as if the doctor had no desire to write another word about what he had witnessed, or perhaps because whatever followed made writing impossible. The attic of the old plantation house was the kind of place time seemed to avoid. Dust coated everything in a thick, undisturbed layer, and the wooden beams groaned softly with each shift of the structure, as though whispering to themselves. The historian had climbed up expecting to find the usual collection of broken tools, rotted trunks, and discarded household items. Instead, he found a wooden crate tucked behind a stack of warped floorboards, its lid nailed shut but weakened by age. When he pried it open, he discovered a bundle of children's belongings, tiny shoes, a cracked porcelain doll, and a stack of yellowed drawings tied together with a brittle ribbon. At first, he thought the sketches were simply the amusements of a long-forgotten child, rough lines and uneven shapes scribbled in charcoal. But when he pulled the top drawing free, a chill crawled up his spine. The sketch showed a woman standing near the slave quarters, her posture slightly hunched, her expression hollow, and her stomach unmistakably rounded with pregnancy. The detail was eerie not because it was precise, but because something about the shading made the woman look as though she were fading into the background, her outline dissolving into the charcoal smudges. But it wasn't the woman that made the historian's breath catch. It was the shadow beside her. Long, unnatural, and warped, it stretched outward at an angle no light source could logically create. The shape didn't resemble a person, or even an animal. It was distorted, limb-like, but too thin, too elongated, as though something had been standing next to her that did not belong to this world. He studied the other drawings, each more unsettling than the last. In every sketch where the pregnant woman appeared, the strange shadow was there too, sometimes looming behind her, sometimes crouched low as though listening, sometimes hovering like a dark stain that followed her everywhere. One drawing, more frantic than the others, showed the woman reaching out while the shadow curled around her feet like smoke. The child who drew these pictures had scrawled their initials in the corner, small and shaky, as if their hand trembled during each stroke. Children don't normally create images filled with fear unless they've seen something that shook them deeply. The historian tried to convince himself that the shadows were simply the wild imagination of a young mind, but the more he examined them, the less certain he became. The angles were too consistent, the shapes too deliberate, the fear embedded in the lines too palpable to dismiss. It was as though the child had witnessed something adults refused to speak about, something they forced themselves to forget. The drawings felt like silent accusations, frozen memories trying to tell a truth no one else dared to record. And as the historian held them, he felt that same shadowed presence settle in the room with him, as if the past had noticed he was looking and had begun to look back. The midwife's letter came to the historian in the most unexpected way. A local collector, sorting through a stack of estate documents he intended to sell, noticed an envelope that felt older than the rest, its edges browned, its wax seal cracked, its paper thin as onion skin. He handed it to the historian out of curiosity, unaware that the fragile letter inside would become one of the most disturbing pieces of the puzzle. The handwriting belonged to a woman named Eliza Thorne, a midwife who had served multiple plantations in the Charleston region during the early 1800s. Her letters usually documented births, illnesses, and the small tragedies of rural life, But this one was different from the moment the historian began to read it. The ink appeared rushed, uneven, as though the writer's hand had struggled to keep pace with her fear. Eliza wrote of being summoned under unusual circumstances. She described how the overseer met her at the edge of the property, refusing to let her travel alone to the quarters and insisting she arrive after dusk. When she finally saw Mara, the pregnant woman was lying on a thin mattress, her breaths shallow, her eyes wide with a terror the midwife claimed she had never seen in any expectant mother. Eliza said Mara clutched her wrist and whispered that something is wrong inside her, not in a physical sense, but in a way that suggested Mara believed the child, or whatever was growing, didn't wholly belong to her. Eliza wrote that she tried to reassure her, but when she placed her hands on Mara's abdomen, she recoiled. The movement beneath the skin had a rhythm, a strange pattern, as though responding to their presence, shifting toward her touch with an intelligence that made her instinctively step back. She described the labor beginning too early, too fast, marked not by pain alone but by a dread that filled the room like smoke. The overseer insisted the midwife continue, his voice shaking despite his attempts to appear composed. Eliza noted that Mara never screamed. Instead, she wept quietly, repeating a phrase the midwife couldn't fully understand, something that sounded like "take it away" or "don't let it know me." When the moment came, Eliza wrote only a few lines, each more frantic than the last. She said she delivered something that no mother should ever have to see, something she could not bring herself to describe directly, for fear that writing the details would somehow call it back. She ended the letter with a confession. She helped hide whatever was taken from Mara that night. She and 2 others buried it before dawn, deep enough that no animal or human would ever find it. Her final words trembled off the page, almost illegible, as she admitted she feared they had not buried it deep enough, because for weeks afterward she felt something following her, watching from corners, lingering in the silence after dark, as though the thing she helped deliver had marked her somehow and was waiting for the right moment to return. Charleston had always carried the weight of its past, but the historian did not expect to find evidence that the city itself had taken deliberate steps to conceal it. When he turned his attention to municipal archives, he assumed he would encounter gaps caused by time, moisture, or carelessness. Instead, he encountered something far more intentional. Year after year of records from the 1830s appeared orderly and complete: marriage logs, property ledgers, census data, shipping reports, but when he reached the documents for the exact year of Mara's disappearance, the pages became noticeably thinner, like a book that had been hollowed out. Dozens of sheets were missing, but the cuts were too clean, too precise to be accidental. Entire sections had been sliced out with a blade, removed so meticulously that only the faintest impression of their former weight lingered in the binding. The historian flagged this anomaly to the archive supervisor, expecting mild curiosity, but instead he witnessed a subtle shift in the man's demeanor. The supervisor's expression remained polite, but his eyes hardened, his voice taking on a practiced neutrality as he insisted the missing pages were simply lost to time. Yet the historian noticed the man's fingers tapping nervously against the table, betraying a tension he clearly fought to hide. The historian pressed further and requested permission to examine the restricted drawer containing altered or suspicious documents. After hesitating, the supervisor reluctantly agreed. What the historian found inside unsettled him more than the missing pages. There were scraps, torn corners of documents, slivers of parchment with faint traces of handwriting, and a handful of pages that had been partially erased using a rudimentary chemical solution, leaving behind pale ghost impressions of words. The most disturbing detail was that despite the wide range of topics these documents once covered, a single name appeared repeatedly, faint but unmistakable: Mara. Sometimes it appeared alone. Sometimes it appeared in lists where the accompanying names were fully legible but hers had been scratched away. In one fragment, her name had been violently inked over dozens of times in heavy strokes that broke through the paper. The historian soon noticed a pattern. Every document related to plantation births, deaths, or medical treatments from that specific year had been altered. Some had entire paragraphs removed. Others had lines scratched out so aggressively that the parchment tore. It was clear someone had spent considerable effort ensuring Mara's presence in the records was as faint and fragmented as possible. But even more telling was what remained untouched. Records from the years before and after were perfectly preserved, suggesting the erasure was targeted, not incidental. The deeper he dug, the more he sensed a quiet conspiracy, a long-standing agreement among those in power to bury a story they believed too dangerous to survive. And the more he uncovered, the more he felt an unsettling truth pressing in from the edges of these mutilated documents. Whatever happened to Mara had not been forgotten by accident, but erased with purpose, and the silence surrounding her was as carefully constructed as any grave. Once the historian began sharing his findings with colleagues and local researchers, he noticed a pattern that unsettled him more than any ledger or hidden letter ever could. Each person who ventured into the investigation, regardless of their distance from the original plantation or the duration of their research, began reporting the same strange experiences, an inexplicable series of dreams, vivid and persistent, that invaded their nights with a clarity that defied imagination. The dreams always followed the same script. They found themselves standing in a narrow, dimly lit corridor, the walls lined with faded, warped wood that creaked beneath their feet. The hallway seemed familiar, though no one could place it consciously. It was simultaneously the slave quarters, the attic, and the city streets at night, as though time and space had folded over themselves. The dreamers could feel a presence just behind them, something moving in the shadows, always staying out of direct sight, brushing the edges of their awareness but never fully revealed. The sensation was not merely fear, it was being observed, measured, and waited upon. Some described hearing soft knocks echoing from the floorboards, identical to the sound reported by local residents in the stillness of the night. Others heard a faint lullaby, too delicate to be fully captured by memory, yet impossible to ignore, drifting as if carried by the walls themselves. No one could make the figure out clearly, yet its shape was unmistakable, elongated, unnatural, and always linked to the figure of a woman who had once been pregnant. It was as though the dream itself were reenacting fragments of a memory trapped somewhere between life and disappearance. Invariably, the dreamers felt compelled to move forward down the hallway, though each step brought only more questions and a growing sense that leaving the corridor was impossible without confronting whatever lingered behind. Even waking hours could not dissolve the impression. People reported unease during the day, a persistent awareness of eyes on their backs, shadows shifting in peripheral vision, and sudden chills in rooms otherwise unaffected by air or temperature. One researcher, after a particularly vivid dream, admitted she felt a pull toward the old plantation at night, as if the building itself called her to uncover what it had long concealed. Another colleague claimed to awaken to faint tapping on the bedroom floor that mirrored the 3 rhythmic knocks described in oral histories. The historian began to recognize the dream as more than coincidence. It was a psychological imprint, a warning, or perhaps a lingering echo of whatever had taken Mara from the world of the living. The dreams bound everyone who sought the truth together, connecting past and present through a shared, unspoken experience. And with each night, the presence in the corridor seemed to grow bolder, drawing those who looked too deeply into a pattern of fear, fascination, and relentless pursuit of a mystery that refused to stay buried. The final revelation came when the historian, guided by fragments from the midwife's letter, the doctor's journal, and the haunted dreams of those who had investigated before him, returned to the overgrown grounds behind the plantation. For years, local accounts had whispered of an area long abandoned, a small clearing shielded by dense trees and weeds, avoided by anyone who knew the stories. The historian had walked past it many times, unaware of the significance, until subtle clues in old letters suggested that something had been hidden there. With nothing more than a trowel, a metal detector, and a flashlight, he began digging along the perimeter of an ancient oak, its roots twisted and blackened by decades of neglect. The soil was damp, unusually soft in patches as though something beneath had shifted or been disturbed before. He worked methodically, each scrape of the trowel bringing a mix of anticipation and dread. After hours, the metal detector emitted a shrill, urgent beep, and the historian paused, holding his breath. Beneath a thin layer of soil, he uncovered a small wooden box, its surface cracked and darkened by time. It was far smaller than a coffin, yet heavy and dense, as if its contents resisted the passage of years. He brushed away the dirt carefully, revealing crude carvings etched into the wood, spirals, lines, and symbols that seemed to pulse with significance beyond any alphabet or language he recognized. The box felt unnatural, its weight disproportionate to its size, almost as though the ground had grown around it intentionally, protecting it, preserving it. He hesitated before opening it, aware that the next moment could shatter every understanding of the events he had pieced together. When he finally lifted the lid, the contents inside were not what he had expected. There was no body, no remains of a child, nothing that resembled what a normal burial might hold. Instead, there was an object wrapped in coarse fabric, small enough to fit in his hands, yet carrying an undeniable presence, a weight that pressed against his chest. Its surface shimmered faintly, almost as if it held a trace of life, and the historian realized immediately that whatever had been taken from Mara, the thing her mother, the midwife, and the doctor had each documented in fearful whispers, was contained here. The object defied explanation. It seemed at once organic and not, alive yet inert, carrying the memory of the woman's pain, her fear, and the unnatural pregnancy that had haunted the plantation for centuries. He knew instinctively that this discovery was only the beginning, that the world had not been meant to see what he now held. The box and its contents were evidence of something deliberately hidden, something the city, the plantation, and the people of the time had worked to erase. And as he stared at it, a faint vibration seemed to emanate from within, a pulse that matched the rhythm of the lullabies, the whispers, the knocks in the night, a pulse that suggested the story had never truly ended, and that whatever had been taken from Mara remained alive in ways no one could fully understand.